Thank you. Yeah. All right, Jabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. L'schus Baruch Hashem to be able to continue our limud together now in the year ahead. So we begin by thanking all of our sponsors. So thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei. Shari and Sarah Wolaski for dedicating all the Shimon Joshos this month. And the schus of Rav Shlema for their grandsons Zechariah Dov, Ben Parol Shira, Shani and Avram Kelman in memory of their beloved parents, and in the schus of all those who need Rav Shlema, Dr. Linda Weinberg, in loving memory of her husband Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe Ben Avram David, Leah's soul as a schos for Rav Shlema for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, and for all those in need of Yeshua. So we obtain on the merit of our Talmud Torah. All those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Chole Yisrael. And with that, let us begin. And of course, it goes without saying that we dedicate our learning in the schos of Achinu B'nei Yisrael. And Achinu B'nei Yisrael in this context, of course, literally is Achinu B'nei Yisrael, that we daven for a continued refuah shalema for the thousands who have been injured in the horrible and overwhelming attacks. Whose cities, and it's not immediately clear ultimately who went ahead or what happened to that individual. bird pair. One of the birds is slaughtered, and the other ultimately, again, the other is dipped in the blood, sprinkled, and then set free. So the Gemara says, if you try to mechashim with tzipori mitzora, it doesn't work. Minolan. From where do we know this? The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. Ne'emar machshir u'mechaper mibifnim, v'ne'emar machshir u'mechaper mibachutz. So we'll say they taught in the Shiva of Rabbi Shmuel. It says machshir and mechaper ultimately in the mikdash, and machshir and mechaper outside of the base mikdash. Now we'll say, what's there seen a machshir and the mechaper? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi says over here, so first Rashi says, Tzipori mitzora, machshirei b'chutz, hein, shehu shaharei chutz li'ir na'asis mitzvasa, ulahachshir hamitzora lavo b'machna. So we'll say, so this is actually very interesting. In the world of karbanos, in the world, I shouldn't say karbanos, in the world of karbanos, there's two different concepts. There's something called a machshir. A machshir is something that enables you to do something else, versus a mechaper, which is a carbon which allows for atonement. Two different things. So for example, by Mitzora, a Mitzora is not permitted to come into Yerushalayim. When he goes in and he brings the bird pairs, that allows him to come into the city. That's called a machshir. As opposed to, let's say, I commit an Aveira, I have to bring a carbon chatas or a carbon asham, that's a mechaper. That ultimately, again, provides for atonement. Two different types of sacrificial rites. So watch this. So the Gemara says as follows. It says, machshir mechaper mibifnim. That I will say, ultimately, again, there's a type of carbon that's a machshir that is brought inside the Beis HaMikdash. Rashi's example of this is the asham of the Mitzora, and it's mechaper mibifnim. What's an example of mechaper in the Beis HaMikdash? All karbanos. All karbanos. So it says machshir mechaper in the Beis HaMikdash, v'ne'emar machshir u'mechaper mibachutz, and ultimately again it says machshir mechaper. So what's an example of a mechaper that's done outside of the Beis HaMikdash? An example of something that affects atonement, but it's done outside of the Beis HaMikdash? Egla rufa. Egla rufa, kind of is something that affects atonement, but remember again, Egla rufa is dafka done outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So that's a mechaper, and then a machshir that is done outside of the Beis HaMikdash. The example of that is the birds of the Mitzora. Ma machshir mechaper amar b'ifnim, just like machshir and mechaper that are done inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Ma machshir mechaper amar b'ifnim. The machshir is treated just like the mechaper. Af machshir u'mechaper amar b'chutz asa b'machshir mechaper. So Rebbe say the machshir and the mechaper that are done outside the Beis HaMikdash. Remember again, the example of the mechaper done outside the Beis HaMikdash is what? Egla rufa. And the machshir done outside of the Beis HaMikdash are the birds of the Mitzora. So the Gemara's limud is like this. Just like we see that the machshir and mechaper that are done in the mikdash are treated the same, so to the machshir and the mechaper done outside of the Beis HaMikdash are treated the same as well. Now I will say, what does that mean for our purposes? What that means for our purposes is the same way you can't use an egla arufa to go ahead and be Mekadesh a woman. Now again, let's take a step back. Why can't you use an Egla Rufa to Mekadesh a woman? Ultimately, because Egla Rufa is compared to Kudshim. And just like Kudshim can't be used for Kiddushin, so to Egla Rufa can't be used for Kiddushin. Now we'll say, now what did we just do? Now, Egla Rufa is a mechaper done outside of the Mikdash. Machshir done outside of the Beis HaMikdash, which are birds of the Mitzora, are compared to mechaper done outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, just as the mechaper, i.e. Egla Rufa, can't be used for Kiddushin, so to the birds of Mitzora can't be used to affect Kiddushin as well. That's the limud. Say itmar. So we'll say now another interesting Gemara. So itmar tzipori mitzora me'emas asurim. But I'll say interesting case here. From what point in time do Mitzora birds become asur? Now I'll say, so once again remember, the Mitzora birds, two birds, one slaughtered. The second one is actually dipped in the blood of the slaughtered one, but ultimately again is set free. So now the Gemara asks, from what point, or at what point, do the Mitzora birds become prohibited? That's the shayla. At what point in time? So remember, let's take a step back. In essence, why can't you use tzipori mitzora to affect Kiddushin? Why not? They're off limits. They're off limits. They're unusable. Now again, we just went through the limud. How do we know they're unusable? So essentially, the way we know they're unusable is because they're compared to Egla Rufa. How do we, and just like Egla Rufa can't be used, Tzipor Mitzora can't be used. How do we know that Egla Rufa can't be used? Because Egla Rufa, ultimately, again, it says kapara like Kudshim. And just like Kudshim can't be used, Egla Rufa can't be used. Fine, so that's the limud. The shaila now is, from what point in time, or at what point in time, do the birds of Mitzora become set aside in general for non-use? In general, for non-use. So Rabbi Yochanan says, from the time that they are slaughtered. Now, obviously, only one of them is slaughtered, right? But it means from the time that one of them is slaughtered, both of them become set aside for non-use. Rish Lakish says, no. Mishas Lakicha, from the moment you take them. In other words, from the moment you take them, essentially, and designate them as Tzipori Mitzora, ultimately they're set aside for non-use. So let's analyze. Rabbi Yochanan says the birds become prohibited from the time of shchita da asrala, because we'll say it's shchita that effectively prohibits them. Right? After all, shchita is, so to speak, the avoda. Right? That's the time that they are used ultimately for this right. Rish Lakish it's actually very interesting. Rish Lakish learns from Shas Lakicha. Rish Lakish learns ultimately from the time you take the karbanos, from the time you take the birds. Me'egla arufa. Ultimately, again, we learn this out from where? From egla arufa. Ma egla arufa. We'll say, I just want to point out, like, it's just so dramatic. Every day of Yom Tov, like one of the most beautiful things that we saw over the course of Chol Hamoed was how the daf went ahead and the daf always connected to what was happening. Right? We saw Eretz Yisrael Gemaras. It was just so beautiful. So, it's heartbreaking. One of the most overwhelming images that came out from Eretz Yisrael from this horrible attack is, the bodies just lying around. You saw the images from Sderot. You saw the images from the concert that these beautiful young people were attacked at. I would say, well, Egla Rufa. What's Egla Rufa? What's Egla Rufa? Egla Rufa is you find a body. You find a Jew who was killed. And you don't know who did it. See, here we don't know the individual who did it, but we know it's incredible. It's almost like the Gemara, the Rebbe Shalom gives us support in times of beauty, like we saw in Chol Hamoed, and in times of difficulty as well. Just how many Egla Rufas? How many dead? How many beautiful, precious souls have we lost? Here, the Gemara always reaches out to us in some way. The Rebbe Shalom always reaches out to us in some way, just letting us know that He's here, that He's with us, both in times of simcha and times of tzara. So Rish Lakish says, Mishas Lakicha me Egla Arufa. Ma Egla Arufa mechaim. But it just as the Egla Arufa ultimately, again, Egla Arufa becomes prohibited from life. In other words, the moment you take the Egla Arufa, we don't really take, we'll call it designate. The moment that you designate the Egla Arufa, ultimately, again, the Egla Arufa is prohibited. Af tzipore mitzora mechaim. So to the birds. The birds, right? So again, we'll say this is the connection. Now, remember again, take a step back, because there's a whole flow here. From where do we establish the connection of Egla Arufa to Tzipore Mitzora? So remember again, we'll say, what's their connection? They're sister concepts. What are the sister concepts? Machshir Mechaper. Machshir Mechaper. So remember again, so Egla Arufa is a Mechaper, it's a tones. Tziporim, the birds of the Mitzora, are a Machshir. What links them? They're the Machshir Mechaper duo, Mibachutz, outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So that's the connection between those two things. So therefore, again, Rish Lakish will say as follows. He learns that from Egla Arufa. Just like Egla Arufa ultimately, again, is prohibited from the time that it's designated, Af Tzipore Mitzora Mechaim. So to Tzipore Mitzora ultimately, again, are also become prohibited from the time that they are designated. The Egla Arufa Gufa Me'emasai. Now, one second. It's interesting. Egla Arufa itself, when does it become prohibited? Rabbi Yanai Gvul Shamati Ba V'Shachachti. I heard, it's interesting, I once heard when Egla Arufa becomes prohibited, but ultimately I forgot. I will say, a Gemara like this is validating on a variety of levels, right? First of all, how often do we find it frustrating in life? I know I learned it, I know I saw it, but I forgot. So the good news is, Rabbi Yanai also learned and forgot things, so Baruch Hashem, we're in good company. So Gvul Shamati Ba V'Shachachti. I heard that there was a border. I heard that there was a gvul, right? I heard that there was a. I heard the halacha. It says actually interesting lashon of gvul. Gvul means gvul literally means like a border, right? I heard that there was like a cutoff, right? I know that there's a cutoff at which point egla rufa becomes prohibited. V'shachachti, but I didn't. I don't remember what it was. V'nas bin chavar yalomar. Then my friends came along and said, "Yiridas lenachal." See, I will say, it's a beautiful Gemara, because what this also tells you is the power of surrounding yourself with a good chevra. See, Rabbi Yanai says, I forgot what the halacha was, but the good news is, my chevra was there with me. And my chevra reminded me ultimately again about what I forgot. When does the egla rufa become prohibited? Yeridasa lenachal isan hio sarta. It's interesting. It's the time when you take the egla rufa down to the dry riverbed. Because remember, that's where the calf is decapitated. It's when you take it down to the dry riverbed, that's ultimately again when it becomes prohibited. That's when it becomes prohibited. So the Gemara says, one second. Ima egla rufa mishas lekicha lo misra. So if that's the case, egla rufa is not prohibited from the moment that you designate it, right? It's not. We'll say, if you go to the market to buy an egla rufa, right, to go and use, it's not prohibited when you purchase it. We just said it's only prohibited when you take it down to the dry riverbed. So I'll say, so remember again, so this whole thing Rish Lakish was trying to build up, just like egla rufa is prohibited mishas lakicha, so too tziporim mitzora are prohibited from shas lakicha, but it's not true. It's not true. Remember again, egla rufa is prohibited when? From the time that it's taken down to the dry riverbed, not from shas lakicha. So to the birds shouldn't be prohibited from shas lakicha as well. To which the Gemara says, no. Hachi hashtahasam islay gvul achrina, hachami islay gvul achrina. We'll say here's the difference. The difference is by egla rufa, there's another gvul. There's another gvul. In other words, there's another point in the process that makes sense to say that now this item is prohibited. So because there's another point, right, there's another stage is the better statement. There's another stage in this process. By Tzipar Mitzvah, we'll say there's two stages. What are the two stages? Designation, that's Lakicha, and Shchita. So if you're not going to go with Shchita, by definition you're going to go with designation. Okay, very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan raised a kasha from Rish Lakish and said as follows, called Tzipar Torah Tochel. We're actually going to talk about this more later on. Pasuk says, you're allowed to eat any kosher bird. What does this come to include? The rabbos esa mushlachas. So mushlachas. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. Remember, as we said before, for the mitzvah, you're taking two birds. One of them you shecht, and what do you do with the other one? You set it free. The rabbos say, what happens if someone traps the freed bird? So that bird is kosher. Right? Again, you're using a kosher bird. So you're allowed to eat it. So therefore, when the pasuk says, called tzipar tahora tochelu, that go ahead and eat any kosher tzipar, that comes to include the mishulachos, that comes to include the bird that was set free. V'zasher lo tochlu mehem. Also, when the pasuk says this you should not eat of them. L'rabos es hashchuta. That refers to the bird that was shechted, right? Even though the bird was shechted, so to speak, you're not allowed to eat the mitzvah bird. V'yisar da'itcha mechayim asura. Now, one second. Let's go back for a second. So remember, this is Rabbi Yochanan asking Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish, if you're right that the mitzvah bird becomes prohibited already from the time that it was designated, right? Then ultimately, again, la'achar shchita mibai. Do you need another pasuk to teach you that it's prohibited once it was shechted? Of course not, because it was already prohibited from the time it was designated. To which the Gemara says, what would you have thought? Midi dahavi akachim. I would have thought that maybe the bird was just like other kachim. How so? The mechayim asiri. Because I will say, just like other kachim, other sacrificial animals, when they're alive, they're prohibited. So we'll say something very interesting. What happens to a typical sacrificial animal, right? When you designate it as a sacrificial animal, what happens? It's prohibited. And then once you shecht it, what occurs? Suddenly, again, it becomes permitted. Again, depending on the carbon, will determine who. But Lamaisa becomes permitted. So I would have thought that the bird, Rish Lakish response, I would have thought that the bird is just like that. Kamash Malon is not. Kamash Malon, that the bird remains prohibited even after shechita. Okay, so we'll say, so just once again, just keep your eye on the ball over here. This is just a fundamental machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Everyone is agreeing everyone is agreeing that the Mitzorah birds, so remember again, how do we get here? We got here because the Mishnah told me I can't be Mekadesh a woman with the pair of Mitzorah birds, right? That's how I got here. Where do I know that from? Because ultimately, again, Mitzorah birds compared to Egla Arufa, right? So that's what I know. Now we're trying to figure out, okay, at what point in time do Mitzorah birds become prohibited? So I have Rabbi Yochanan saying from the time that they're shechted, and Reish Lakish saying from the time that they are designated or taken, so to speak. So I say, so now we're just a back and forth between Abaye and Rav. So Abaye and Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan. So today's another kasha, shachta v'nimtzas treifa. So what's the interesting case? Let's say again, so same case, bird pair, right? So you go ahead and you take the pair of birds. You take the pair of birds, and what happens? You shecht it, and it turns out that one of them is a treifa. Now, the Gemara is operating under the assumption over here that one of the ways in which an animal becomes a treifa is it can become a treifa during shechita. So, for example, if instead of cutting the simanim, you tear them, right? There are different ways in which you could render an animal a treifa through shechita. So that's the assumption. We'll see why we're talking about. So let's say the animal, right, the bird becomes a treifa while being slaughtered. Well, it's talacha. Yikach zug lishnia varishon muteres ba'ana. So we'll say, so you don't have to bring a totally new pair. What do? The sect will call it bird number 2, which was going to be the one that was going to be released. So that one is fine. You just have to bring a replacement shchita bird. Right, replacement bird for shchita. So the Gemara said, now if at the end of the day, the bird ultimately again, v'harishona muteres ba'ana, and now the bird that was a treifa is muter ba'ana. So you can't eat it, but you could sell it, right? You can feed it to your animals. So Gemara says, 1 second. But we'll say, but 1 second, if Reish Lakish, if you're right, that the bird is prohibited from the time that it's designated, so then even if it turned out that it was a treifa because of shchita, why should it be permitted by ana? Right? It was already usher from the time that it was designated. To which the Gemara says, Amalei, no, Reish Lakish responds, no. Hachama askinon, kigam shenim says treifa b'bnei me'eha. The animal wasn't made a treifa through shechita, rather what happened? When you cut open the bird, you found that it was a treifa like it's in its intestines. In other words, it had a pre-existing treifa condition. Rabbi say, what happens when it has a pre-existing treifa condition? The lochal Allah Kiddusha klal. Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. When you have a pre-existing treifa condition, then what happens is the designation as a sacrificial bird never devolves upon it to begin with. So we'll say, so that's the chap over here. So Reish Lakish will say, according to Reish Lakish, in a normal circumstance, if you shecht the bird and it turns out to be a treifa, that bird is still asr ba'ana. You have to bring a replacement bird. But ultimately, again, that bird is asr ba'ana. The case over here, where the Brisa says that if you shecht the bird and it's a treifa, the bird is mutter ba'ana, you can get benefit from it, is a case where you found a pre-existing treifa condition, right? Literally in the intestines. So in other words, this animal was a treifa from the beginning. If it was a treifa from the beginning, the designation would never devolved upon the animal. If the designation never devolved, that's why ultimately, again, it remains permitted by ana, for ana. Incredible. So Eisvei Shachta Shlobe Eizova Shlobe Eiz Erez V'Shlobe Shnia Tolas. So this is an interesting case. We know that when you shecht the Mitzorah bird, I will say the halacha is there's a whole bunch of ingredients that go into the purification process over here, right? So you have ultimately again azov. Azov is hyssop. You have eitz erez, a piece of cedar wood, and shni tolas, a piece of crimson wool, red wool. I will say this whole thing is mixed together, right? And then ultimately again the bird is dipped. The bird is used for sprinkling. Fine. So let's say so the the idea over here is when you shecht the Mitzorah bird, all of these, and of course water as well, all of these items are supposed to be prepared before you. If you go ahead and you shecht the animal, and ultimately again these items were not prepared, so then the process is invalid. It's actually fascinating. Right? Let's say the process is only valid if all of the ingredients are prepared in front of you. Now, let's say now, if you think about it, it's actually quite amazing. It's actually quite amazing because the Musar Haskell is, if you want to be successful in something in life, you have to have a process planned out. It doesn't mean that you won't pivot, and it doesn't mean you won't change the process. But so often in life, what ends up happening is we get an idea or we get inspired to do something, we start, and then we fall and we fail. Why? Why? It's not because of a lack of resolve. It's not because of a lack of commitment. It's often because we actually didn't create a process. If you want to be successful for anything in life, you have to create a process. You have to create a system. You have to place out in front of you all of the things you need in order to be successful. Again, sometimes you have to recreate the process. Sometimes you have to go ahead and totally demolish the process, put a new process in place. Sometimes you have to pivot, but lamaisa, you can't be successful for anything in life unless you create a real process that enables success. An incredible yisod. So same thing with Tzipar Mitzora. If you don't have the items in front of you, you don't have the ingredients in front of you, you are not going to be successful. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, what happens if you did the shechita and the items were not there laid out in front of you? Rabbi Yaakov says, listen, the bird is still going to be prohibited because at the end of the day it was set aside ultimately again for the mitzvah. Fine. Rabbi Shimon says, well listen, since the bird was shechted and it wasn't for the purpose of the mitzvah, i.e. the process did not allow for a proper shechita, therefore again the bird is mutter. So says the Gemara, Ad kan lo pligi elamar savar shechita she'ena ru'ya shma shechita, umar savar shechita she'ena ru'ya lo shma shechita. So we'll say the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, really, what's their machlokes? The machlokes is what is the status of what we call the shechita she'ena ru'ya. Shechita she'ena ru'ya means a shechita that does not produce definitive results. Right? In other words, it doesn't produce a desired. She'ena ru'ya, it's not fit, right? It's not fit. It doesn't create the desired outcome. So both say, so the machlokes or Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Shimon is, what's the status of a shechita she'ena ru'ya? One opinion says it's still a valid shechita. Second opinion says it's not a valid shechita. However, the koli alma mia mechaim lamisri. They both say, now bottom line, but what do you see from this? What do you see from this? Everyone is agreeing, I will say, that at what point in time does the bird become prohibited? Shechita. Everyone seems to be agreeing with Rabbi Yochanan that it's only shechita that prohibits the bird, but during the lifetime, right, mishas lakicha, from the time you take the bird is not going to be prohibited. To which the Gemara says, in reality, Tanaihi. In reality, Rabbi says this whole thing is a machlokes tanoim. The turn to be Rabbi Shmuel, Ne'emar machshir, Rabbi says what we saw before. Ne'emar machshir mechaprim, Ne'emar machshir umechaprim mibifnim, V'ne'emar machshir mechaprim mibachutz. So it's like we saw before. There's a concept of machshir and mechaper inside the mikdash. Right? So what's the example of machshir and mechaper inside the mikdash? So remember again, machshir inside the mikdash, the example of that was the asham mitzora. Asham mitzora, right? The mechaper inside the Beis HaMikdash was an example of something that atones inside the Beis HaMikdash. Gans karbanos. And then it says, machshir u'mechaper mi bachutz. This is machshir mechaper bachutz. Now remember again, was an example ultimately again of machshir bachutz, a machshir outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Sipori Mitzora. An example of mechaper outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Example, egla rufa. So watch this. Just like machshir mechaper set inside the Beis HaMikdash, asaba machshir ki mechaper. So the machshir is treated like the mechaper. Af machshir u'mechaper amar b'chutz. So Tzrabo say machshir mechaper outside of the Mikdash. Asabo machshir ki mechaper. Ultimately, again, we go ahead and we treat the machshir just like the mechaper. So we'll say, so again, remember, if that would be the case, then we would say that just like egla arufa is prohibited when? It's prohibited when? From the time that is designated, or more specifically, from the time that is taken down to Nachal Isan, so to Tzipori Mitzora would be prohibited as well. So we'll say, bottom line, we see a fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which seems to be a greater machlokes Tanaim as well. Rashi says, look at Tanai, Rashi says, Hi Tanai Svir, look at the Ka'amrit, the Misra, the time that Rabbi Yishmael, the of Machshir Mechaper, Svir like the Misra, Mechaim Ki Mechaper. So we'll say, so machlokes Tanaim, at what point in time does the bird pair of the Mitzorah become prohibited? Is it from the time of Shechita, or is it from the time of designation from the Kicha? So we'll say, by the way, how do we paskin? So the Rambam paskin is like Rabbi Yochanan, namely that the birds become prohibited from Shechita. Now we'll say, here's what's interesting. So in this respect, as much as there is a connection between Tzipori Mitzora and Egla Rufa. We'll say, what's the halachic connection between Tzipori Mitzora and Egla Rufa? What's the connection? They're both done mibachutz, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and they're sister concepts. Egla Rufa is a mechaper. It provides atonement mibachutz, outside of the Mikdash. Tzipori Mitzora are a machshir mibachutz, right? Mibachutz, both done outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So I both say, but that's kind of where the connection ends a little bit. Why? Because Lamaisa, whereas Egla Rufa becomes prohibited when? When does Egla Rufa become prohibited? From the time that it's taken down to Nachal Eson, from the time that it's taken down to the dry riverbed. So ultimately, again, Tzipori Mitzora, we will paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, become prohibited at the time of Shechita. Incredible. So we'll say, let's analyze. Gufa. Says the Gemara Gufa. Called Tzipor Tahora Techela. We'll say 3 lines up from the bottom on Nun Zayin Amud Aleph. Called Tzipor Tahora Techela. So the pasuk says, you can eat any kosher bird. What does this come to include? L'rabos es hamishulachas. This comes to include a bird, right? So we'll say, so remember again, you have the bird pair of the Mitzora. One of the birds is shechted. The other bird is set aflight, right? So let go. Let's say, again, we'll say, can you imagine, Ruvain's a Mitzora, he does the process, he goes ahead and he releases the bird, right? He releases the bird. Now what happens? Shimon is out trying to catch dinner. And what does he catch? The bird. Now, Bosai, Bipashlos, he has no idea, right? He doesn't wear a sign on his around his neck, I'm the Mishulachas, right? So Lamaisa, again, so he catches the birds. What's halacha? It's kosher. It's kosher. Rabba's a Mishulachas. The pasuk also says, then the pasuk also says, this is what you can't eat of them. L'rabos es hashchuta. That comes to include the shechted bird. So we'll say again, same way that you're allowed to eat the bird that is set free, you're not allowed to eat the shechted bird. I think, Martha, 1 second, how do you know which is which? Maybe you should switch around the drushes. And we'll say maybe the halacha is, you're allowed to eat the shechted bird, you're not allowed to eat the bird that's sent away. Rabbi Yochanan, lo matzinu ba'alei chayim shasurim. Then we'll say, so Rashbi, Mishra Yochai. Shomai Yochai comes along and says that ultimately, again, we have never found Baalei Chayim that are Aser. Never found Baalei Chayim that are Aser. In other words, we'll say, so Lamaisa, again, Lamaisa, that there's no such thing as an animal that's living that remains Aser. So therefore, it has to be that the bird that is set free ultimately, again, is permitted. So Gemara says, really? We never find a living animal which remains free. So Gemara says, Hari mukta, we'll say on the base, mukta v'ne'evad. We'll say, what about an animal? Mukta means an animal that was set aside to be offered up as a carbon to Avodah Zarah. Or ne'evad, an animal that was served as Avodah Zarah. The Baalei Chayim ninu. We'll say, these are examples of living animals. Va'asiri. I will say, they are prohibited. They are prohibited. So the Gemara says, Ki asiri legavoa lehedyot mishroshari. They're prohibited ultimately, again, for sacrificial use in the Beis HaMikdash. That's what they're prohibited. But ultimately, again, lehedyot, for simple, mundane, ordinary use, they remain permitted. Okay, so Maskef Rabbi Yirmiyah, Harei V'nirva Be'edim De Baalei Chayim Ninu V'asiri. We'll say, what about an animal that was either bestialized, I don't know if that's the right word, but in other words, a person had relations with it, or ultimately, again, the animal had relations with a person. Or, so let's say it's simpler, an animal engaged in an act of bestiality. Such an animal, I will say again, is a living animal, but yet that animal forever remains prohibited. That remains prohibited. So let's say, so ultimately, again, the truth is, fine. Rabbi Yochanan, lo matzinu rov baalei chayim shasurim. And let's say, this is such an incredible yesod. Rather, so Rashbi the Gemara amends the statement. By saying, the majority of living animals do not remain prohibited. So let's say, so remember again, let's just take this full circle. So the Gemara is making a drasha when the pasuk said, called tzipar tahora tochelu. You can eat any kosher bird. The Gemara says, what is that coming to include? The mushlachas, the bird that is sent away. The bird that is sent away. How do we know that refers to that? Because Rashbi said, because you never find living animals that remain prohibited. So therefore, it must be that the bird that is set aflight becomes permitted. So I will say, the Gemara says, I'll show you cases of living animals which remain prohibited. So therefore the Gemara amends the statement to say most living animals don't remain prohibited. So I tell you something absolutely amazing, which is, you see from here a very important yesod in life, which is sometimes people make definitive statements. Right? You ever have this, like, I get so that everyone is upset. Everyone this, right? Everyone. People do this all the time. It's always like, let's say, Klal Gadol in life is, there are very few things that you could say in an absolute sense. Very few things that ultimately, again, you could say everyone, everything, all the time. You could say many, a lot, rove. It's an important yesod. It's also important how we look at the world and how we look at life. So Lamais again, the Gemara says we started out by saying living animals are never prohibited. I don't think that's totally true. The Gemara says you're right. Most of the time, living animals are not prohibited. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right to the Rabbi Shmuel Tana Damakra B'shilach al pnei asada. So we'll say the pasuk says again, talking about the birds of the Mesorah. You shall go at v'shilach. You shall release it onto the field. V'shilach al bnei asada, release it onto the field. This is v'shilach es hatzipor hachaya al bnei asada. You take the living bird and you set it free. You set it free. So the Gemara says, Kis sada, mas sada mutares, avhai nami mutares. So we'll say the drush is just like a field is permitted, so to this bird that is set free is also permitted. Hai sada lahachiyuda asa. Does the sada come to teach us that? Or we'll say sada doesn't come to teach us that. So the Gemara will say, I just want to point out, this is another proof, another raya, right? The Rabbi Shmuel is saying, this is the proof. How do you know that the released bird is permitted? So the Gemara says, because the Torah says you shall release the bird onto the field. Just like a field is something that is permitted, so to the released bird is permitted as well. To which the Gemara says, really, is that what Sada comes to teach me? The Gemara says, I need Sada to teach me something else. So the Gemara says, Sada teaches me, Sada teaches me, I will say, that you shouldn't stand at the port of Yafo and release the bird into the sea. Right? Or bigvas v'yizer ken lemidbar, or to stand in gvas and release the bird into the desert. Or don't stand outside the city and release the bird into the city. Ela kol she'omid be'ir v'yizer ken chutz l'choma. Both said the idea is the Torah is giving us a process that when you release the bird, you're supposed to release the bird into the open, right? But not into the sea, and ultimately, again, not into the desert, and not into a city, rather la sada. So actually, sada is coming to teach me how I release this bird. The other opinion will say, Imke nichtov kra sada. Pasuk just sada. My hasada. What does hasada teach me? Shma mina tarti. Ultimately teaches me two things. We'll say two things being number one, that just as the sada is permitted, so the birds are permitted. And number two, that when releasing the bird has to be released into a field outside of the city. Rava Amar, they will say, this is incredible. Rava says essentially all of you guys are getting too complicated about this. Remember again, what are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out, how do I know that the bird that is set free ultimately, again, is permitted? Someone else catches it, it's permitted. Rava says it's very simple. Lo amra Torah shalach l'takala. Now we'll say, can you imagine if the Mesorah bird was prohibited? Rava says, you know what that would mean? That would mean every single time you'd catch a bird, what would be the halacha? You can't eat it. Why not? Safik daraisa. Maybe this is a Mesorah bird. So Rava says, come on. Do you think that the Ribono Shel Olam would set us up with a stumbling block? You think he would set us up with a stumbling block? That at the end of the day, he would allow for something that could cause a person to inadvertently go ahead and eat something that is sanctified or that is consecrated? Doesn't make any sense. The fact that it's let go, set free into the wild, so to speak, into the sada, which means anyone could potentially trap that. Torah would never put a stumbling block. We'll say, the Ribono Shel Olam never puts a stumbling block in front of us. The Ribono Shel Olam wants one thing and one thing only, and that is our success. And He sets us up for that success each and every day. That's all He wants. And He would never, ever, chas v'shalom, ever put a stumbling block in front of us. So we'll say, after all the drushas, Rava says, it's not a drasha that tells me that the bird is permitted. It's logic. It's quite fascinating. Okay, B'seyar Nazir. So we'll say a man can't be Mekadesh Shulman with the hair of a Nazir. That is an interesting shaitel, right? The shaitel, right? The seven nazir. So the Gemara says minol and the Amrikra. So the pasuk says kodesh yihiyeh. Yeah, sorry, kadosh yihiyeh gadol para sa'arosho. So it says kadosh. So the Gemara says gidulo ye kadosh. Ima kodesh tofes es dama v'yotzei. If that's the case, if you tell me that the hair is consecrated, well, remember again, you could take a consecrated item and what? Redeem it with money, transfer the sanctity onto the money, and then the item itself becomes unconsecrated. So can you do that with hair as well? Af ser nazir nami tofes es dama v'yotzei. So can you deconsecrate hair? So Gemara says no. Mikarinan kodesh. Kadosh Karinan. But the Torah doesn't describe the hair as Kodesh, right? Rather, it refers to it as Kadosh. We'll say, what does Kadosh mean? So the Gemara understanding Kadosh means something that is inherently consecrated, that cannot be deconsecrated. Its status cannot be lifted and shifted onto something else. Incredible. But Pater Chamar, we'll say further, remember, firstborn donkey. So firstborn donkey, the halach is you can redeem it. If you don't redeem it, then what? Then the donkey itself is decapitated. So you can't be with a Pater Chamar. So we'll say our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon. Why? What did Rabbi Shimon say? The Sanya, Pater Chamar Asr Bana de Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Huda said a Pater Chamar is prohibited for Anah. Rabbi Shimon Matir. Rabbi Shimon says ultimately again it is mutter. It is mutter. Rav Nachman Rav Baravua la'achar arifa v'divrei akol. So we'll say the machlokes is only before the calf is decapitated. After it's decapitated, everyone agrees that what? That it is asr ba'ana. It is asr ba'ana. So therefore, Rabbi says, halacha l'maisa. Everyone agrees the calf is asr ba'ana, and therefore again can't be used for Kiddushin. Incredible. Basar b'chalav. So what's the interesting case? What about basar b'chalav? We'll say, right, out of all the cases we have seen, this seems to be the first one that maybe is like a little bit more relatable. Right? So l'maisa again, what about, you can't be mechashim on basar b'chalav, a mixture of milk and meat. Why not? Minalan. The time of Rabbi Shmuel, lo sivan shel gedi b'chalav gimel pamim. So we'll say the Torah states the prohibition of lo sivan shel gedi b'chalav 3 times. Echad Isra Achila, the Echad Isra Na, the Echad Isra Bishal. We'll say one time is to teach you that you're not allowed to eat basar b'chalav. Second time you can't get hana from basar b'chalav, and the third time you can't make. You actually can't create basar b'chalav. So the fact that basar b'chalav is asr ba'ana indicates to me that I cannot use it for Kiddushin. But our Mishnah does not reflect the view of the following Tana. We'll say which Tana. So the Gemara says, "Design Rabbi Shimon Yehuda Omer Basar b'chalav Asar ba'achila Mutar ba'ana." So we'll say, so there is another opinion. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says that as much as you can't eat basar b'chalav, you are permitted to get hana'ah from basar b'chalav. Shnei Amar ki am kadosh atah la'Hashem Elokecha lo siva shel gedi b'chalav. The pasuk says you are a holy nation unto Hashem your God. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Ula'alanu omer va'anshe kodesh tinyuli. So we'll say the Torah uses the same lashon of kodesh. Be a holy people, and we'll say that's talking about a treifa. Basar basada treifa lo sochelu. You can't eat a treifa. Mat lahalon asr b'achila. We'll say just like a treifa is only asr b'achila, or mutar ba'ana. You can get an arba. Remember again, what's a treifa? Treifa is an animal that dies without shechita. So you can't eat it, but you can get hana from it. So just like a treifa you can get hana from, afkan asr b'achila mutar ba'ana. So to basar b'chalav, you can't eat it, but you are allowed to get hana. So it's just actually interesting. So there is a machlokes by basar b'chalav. Everyone will agree that you can't eat it. Everyone will also agree that you can't cook it. There's a machlokes, can you get benefit from it? So I'll say, so that's a machlokes. Our Mishnah, which says that you can't be mekadesh a woman with basar b'chalav, clearly subscribes to the opinion that says that what? You can't get hana from it. So because you can't get hana from it, therefore halacha l'maisa, you can't use it for Kiddushin. I will say, I just want to mention just the last moment. I said this over last night by in our last little bit of Yom Tov together, but I think it bears repetition. Just to finish off the show, we'll stop at the 2 dots today. And I will say, the top of today's daf, the top of Nun Zayin, which Rabbi Richter gave a beautiful shir yesterday. He covered in yesterday's shir, quoted Rabbi Akiva. I will say, and Rabbi Akiva, the whole machlokes of Es Hashem Elokecha Tira, Fear Hashem, Shimon Ha'am Suni, they didn't know how to darshan the S. Rabbi Akiva darshan the S to include Talmidei Chachamim. Whole machlokes there. I would say it was very striking. I mentioned this yesterday. That very striking that in yesterday's daf, a day of such sadness. On one hand, such simcha because it was Yom Tov for us, but such sadness. You quoted Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev Zechusa Yagin Alinu quotes in the beginning of Parshas Noach that Rabbi Akiva was a Gilgul of Moshe Rabbeinu. Gilgul of Moshe Rabbeinu. I felt it was such an amazing thing that on the day that we said goodbye to Moshe Rabbeinu, because really Simchas Torah, as beautiful as it is, there's an element of pain of saying goodbye to Moshe Rabbeinu. That on the day that we said goodbye to Moshe Rabbeinu, we have Rabbi Akiva, who's the Gilgul of Moshe Rabbeinu. And what was the gadlus of Rabbi Akiva? The gadlus of Rabbi Akiva was Akiva Nichamtanu, Akiva Nichamtanu. Rabbi Akiva was always the one who brought Nechama. Rabbi Akiva was always the one who maintained a constant sense of optimism and a constant belief in the nitzchis of Klal Yisrael. As Rabbi Akiva himself was being tortured to death by the Romans, he instilled everyone around him with a sense of optimism and a sense of hope. And Chevra, it is not an accident that the Ribono Shel Olam gave us a Rabbi Akiva on Simchas Torah. It is not an accident. Let's say we feel so broken and we feel so overwhelmed and each of us feels so sad. And I would say sometimes we think like our hishtadlus is to keep checking our phones and like see what's happening on the news. We must remain in the know about what's going on. I would say don't use your time during these heartbreaking days to check the news ticker. That is not going to move the needle for Klal Yisrael at all. One more story, one less story. That's not what you're doing for Klal Yisrael. And I will say, Rabbi Akiva teaches us that first of all, Klal Yisrael will always survive, and Klal Yisrael will always thrive, and this will forever be a dark chapter within our people's history. I think we know that Shmini Atzeres will never be the same for Klal Yisrael. There is now a tragedy, a massacre that is associated with this day in the ongoing consciousness of Klal Yisrael. But Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. In the midst of all of this, I will say, we always have to maintain a constant sense of optimism. And we cannot lose ourselves in the black hole of despair. The coming days, and maybe even the coming weeks, we'll see funerals, we'll see levayas, and we don't know where this journey is going to go. We don't know how it's going, but one thing we do know is that Klal Yisrael always prevails. Klal Yisrael always prevails. And as I mentioned, as I started this year, each of us has the opportunity to do our part in advancing the collective agenda. Meir Askey sent me a message today, because I messaged him last night. He's delivering food to soldiers everywhere. He's just delivering food. See, the difference is in Eretz Yisrael, you could do something biyadayim. You could do something biyadayim to actively help. We're going to find ways to do things also. Rabbi say, just understand. I learn Torah, I'm doing something. I daven with kavana, I'm doing something. I give tzedakah, I'm doing something. I do a chesed for another Jew, I'm doing something. We could help out in the efforts of Klal Yisrael as well. We cannot, like Rabbi Akiva whispers in our ears, do not lose yourself to despair. We can't shuffle around, eyes cast downward with a black cloud. There is a black cloud hovering over us. But you know what the incredible part is? That black cloud will dissipate. That black cloud will give way to most magnificent and incredible sunshine. And once again, we will bask in the rays of a victorious, luminescent, spiritually strong Klal Yisrael. That's why Rabbi Akiva was with us on Simchas Torah, and it's that chizuk that guides us, Rabbi Osai, in the days and in the weeks and in the months ahead. Klal Yisrael has always been strong, and Klal Yisrael will always be strong. We have to get ourselves together. We have to roll up our sleeves. We have to start producing for our people and for our nation. Each of us, in small ways and big ways, Rabbi Osai, could move the needle for Klal Yisrael. Kodesh Baruch Hu should just give us the chizuk. Give us, the Jews of the diaspora, chizuk. Certainly give Achinu B'nai Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael the chizuk as well. And Halavai Rabbi Osai, we should be zocha to see beautiful days of bracha ahead.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam